Hello, my name's Eric, he, him. I am a design systems wonk at AdHoc, where I work on healthcare.gov and medicare.gov design systems. So if you ever find a problem with how the site looks, let me know, and I'll get on that as soon as possible. I write for CSS Tricks and Smashing Magazine about accessibility and inclusive design. I also contribute to the Mozilla Developer Network for things like accessibility. And I help maintain the A11Y project, which coincidentally enough actually just rolled out support for dark mode themes. So there's some nice kind of convergence with this talk. So, before we get into it, I do want to say that this talk includes full screen video, high contrast values, and a mild strobing effect as I switch from regular view mode to a high contrast mode theme. If that's something that you feel isn't for you, I encourage you to, walk away from this talk and then come back for Shell at the top of the hour. I'm really excited for her talk as well, so hopefully you are too. To continue onward, let's talk about the ideal here. Let's imagine a pure, perfect world of platonic academic purity. Like designers and developers talk to each other, dogs and cats wear cute costumes and get along. Compliance isn't an afterthought because it's baked into the beginning of every project. Everything is WCAG AA compliant, and Bob Ross is president. It's lovely. However, we don't live in a perfect world. Things get hurled over the wall, dogs and cats fight, and project managers cut support sprinting to get stuff out the door. And this kind of leads to what I call a gray and a gray phenomenon, where sometimes design values aren't quite good enough to hack it. You either have something where it's just too light to be legible, or you have the kind of the opposite where it's so close but not close enough to be like WCAG compliant, perceptual, contrasty enough. These kinds of things don't make you friends with the design team, but we're here to make accessible experiences, not placate. Although ideally, you can actually do both. The real world is complicated. There are countless factors to consider when doing compliance work. And, a hard truth about accessibility is sometimes what makes a good experience for one individual is actually bad for another. For example here, we're going to talk about scotopic sensitivity, extreme contrasts. So you might think that when doing contrast work, pure white on pure black or vice versa might be the perfect solution because they're polar opposites and they're as light and as dark as they can possibly be, respectively. However, when you consider things like myopia, photophobia, cataracts and cloudy vision, and traumatic brain injuries, these extreme contrasting values can actually cause harm and hurt someone. And that's something I've kind of learned about as I continue my accessibility journey, and it's I think it speaks exactly to the whole phenomenon of testing your work first of all, and second of all understanding that there is no one perfect solution for everyone. And because of this, you don't know what you don't know. So your option here is you want to keep your content open and interoperable. You want to create best guesses for creating experiences that don't intentionally or inadvertently lock people out. But you also want to give the end user the ability to self-select a solution that works best for them. And I'd like to share this quote by Aaron, and I think it's really, really kind of helps frame this talk. It's important to recognize that experience is not a singular thing, or experience is not universal. Not everyone accesses content the same way we do on the same devices, on the same networks, in the same modalities we do. And when we design the web in the way that we experience it, we actually limit the way that other people experience it. We actually exclude the people that are not like us, and that's not great. So enter high contrast mode, a thing that exists. It is a special mode that ties into the operating system, and it hooks into the way that the operating system presents interface elements, including the browser's content, but also things like the Windows taskbar, folder views, other applications. And it allows the user to manipulate the presentation of color on their operating system in a very deliberate and controlled way. The other thing is now it is we live in the future, and forced color mode also exists. High contrast mode is Microsoft specific, whereas forced colors mode is an initiative to make a cross browser standard. More on this in a little bit. But these are two things you can kind of contend with when you're creating accessible experiences on the web. Where does high contrast mode work and forced colors mode work? Well, high contrast mode works on Windows 7 and up and Internet Explorer 10 and up, whereas forced colors mode works for Windows 10 and up and Microsoft Edge. Microsoft Edge is a pretty cool browser. I like it a lot, especially compared to Chrome. I think it offers a lot of nice kind of usability features. The other thing to kind of point out here is Microsoft Edge has backwards compatibility for high contrast mode, whereas high contrast mode does not have forwards compatibility, which means that high contrast mode will be forever consigned to Internet Explorer, whereas Microsoft Edge can support high contrast mode code. The nuance here is while Microsoft is removing support for Windows, Microsoft is removing support for Internet Explorer, hopefully for the last time. You really want to investigate who your audience is to make sure that they, are actually using or not using Internet Explorer. And I think there's a lot of nuance here, and the only way to really kind of figure this out is to actually talk to the people that use your product. Both high contrast mode and forced colored mode have different themes to pick from. Out of the box, they ship with high contrast 1, high contrast 2, high contrast black, and high contrast white themes. And you can see these themes applied to Tech Access Oklahoma's homepage, as well as Windows 10 operating system. This is high contrast mode theme 1. You'll note that it is very contrasty. The text is bright yellow on a black background, buttons are blue. Everything is kind of thrown into stark relief, and that is to aid in legibility. This is high contrast theme 2. This is high contrast theme black, and this is high contrast theme white. Both high contrast mode and forced colors mode support the creation of custom themes. And if you're observant, notice that some of these color combinations aren't actually WCAG AA compliant, and that speaks to the customization aspect of being able to create what works for you. The way to do this in Windows 10 is you click on System Settings, Ease of Access, and then the High Contrast tab. And then you have the option to choose a theme. I'm selecting High Contrast Theme 1, and then I'm going to drag the file window over to show kind of how it affects stuff, and then drag it back into position. And then you can create a custom theme by clicking on each of the values. So text, I'm changing to red. Hyperlinks, I'm changing to dark blue. Disabled text, I'm changing to gray. Background, I'm changing to yellow. Button text, I don't know. The foreground, I'm going to change to red. And the background color of buttons to white. And yeah, let's apply it. So it's going to prompt me to save. And I'm going to call it, I don't know, hot dog. Save it, applies, it'll take over. And the colors that I've chosen propagate across the operating system. And, it looks kind of hideous, but that's kind of the point. It is a color combinations that might work for my specific access needs, and the operating system and the feature allows me to pick them, and that's a highly intentional act. So now, who uses high contrast themes, you might be wondering? And I say everyone. People who experience a biological condition, can be permanent or temporary. People experiencing an environmental condition, think bright light and glare. No light and dark UI can be permanent or temporary as well. Low contrast themes are a thing as well. Some people deliberately set values that are very light and low contrast to aid in legibility, and it's cool that this feature lets them do that. And you might be saying like, okay, cool, I'm on board. This all sounds great. Tell me the number so I can take it back to my organization. And I'm gonna say, nah, no, sorry. The thing here is that even if half of 1% of all Windows users use high contrast mode or force color mode, that is an incredibly large amount of people. And the other thing is, it's kind of a bad way to think about this. That one person that might be using this feature, we don't know who they are, what they want. They could be an incredibly important person. They could be, a family member. And we don't want to restrict a way for them to use technology. So, the appeal here is once you're aware of this feature, kind of how you use it. I think it's also like a fallacy to think this is specifically for disabled people. Here's a tweet I quite like from a man named Sean. Pro tip, max brightness and high contrast mode enables, allows you to use your laptop in the garden. Looks ugly but functional. Ugly but functional is kind of my whole design aesthetic, but jokes aside, this is some random person on Twitter who discovered this kind of secret feature and is using it to have a lovely time using a computer, not in an office, but in a nice kind of nature setting. It sounds pretty great. If you do need to plead a case, this does tie back to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, namely Success Criterion 148, Visual Presentation. Foreground and background colors can be selected by the user. Browsers do allow for this via settings or extensions, but this is kind of, if you do need to plead a case for high contrast mode support, where your argument may hinge on for somebody that is not receptive to appeals to empathy. In terms of actual support in technology, Firefox currently did a lot of work behind the scenes to set up support and never really completed it. If you really dig in there, it's almost there, and that's kind of frustrating, but more on that in a sec. Chrome, bafflingly, will detect that it is active, but it will push you to install high contrast dark theme extensions. This is not true high contrast mode or forest color mode support. Again, this is going to change, more on that in a second. And here's that second. So modern browsers observing web standards, Chrome, Firefox, and Safari. Edge already is here in terms of support. They are poised to adopt force colors mode once it becomes adopted as a standard, meaning that these weird half measures and these not quite live code will become a thing of the past, which is really cool because it means somebody can pick the browser that they want and not use Internet Explorer or Edge only to get the full force color mode experience. So, how does this work under the hood? Here is a secret. It's semantic HTML. Let's have a little round of applause for semantics. Hooray. When we're saying, like, as accessibility people, semantic HTML is important, here's another thing it does for you for free that you might not be aware of. When you declare a button using the button element, it tells the operating system that this is a button, it does button-y things, and that includes mapping to force color mode or high contrast mode keywords. So when I was creating that custom theme with the button foreground and background, it knows what a button is on a web page the same way the operating system knows what a button is in a save confirm dialog, asking you if you want to save changes or not. And that's pretty cool. So, for the web, we're going to want to take advantage of this semantic HTML hook and then, use CSS what it was designed for, which is to control presentation. You have media queries available to you for high contrast mode, and you'll note the Microsoft -ms vendor prefix. There are media queries for white on black, black on white, and any theme active. Of these three, I recommend only using active because that targets both black on white, white on black, high contrast mode theme 1 and 2, as well as any custom theme a user may have set up. There is also the new Forced Colors active media query, and you'll note that that again is vendor prefix free. So that is any browser that supports the upcoming standard can use it. It's great. It's lovely. It's wonderful. Both Forced Colors mode and high contrast mode map back to CSS2 system color keywords. This is a kind of a blast from the past, but to walk through it, the web way back when the web was more of a document serving model as opposed to an app-based platform delivery model, we thought it would be cool to describe color variable values that would map to effectively Windows interface values. So you'll see some like UI, Windows UI stuff here, like button face, info, stuff, button text, scroll bar, window text. Big kind of suite of keywords to pick from. And the idea that you could kind of mimic the operating system with your CSS for whatever website you were making. The downside of this and why CSS2 color support didn't really kick off is because a bad actor could hypothetically construct something that looked very official. Here I have an image that is spoofing a Windows 95 dialog saying Windows requires additional information before it continue displaying this web page. Please provide your credit card number. And this looks legit, and because it looks legit, people might fall for it. So that's why this never really got any traction. However, flash forward to 2009, where Windows High Contrast mode kind of kicked off. It borrowed these keywords. So of the set made available to us, it actually adopted a subsection: button face, window, highlight text, and window text. It pruned it down to a limited set. And if you remember our customization options when we created our custom theme earlier, these keywords might look a little familiar. So to map this out, Windows High Contrast mode, for links, you'll want to use an anchor element, the A tag. For regular static text, you'll want to use window text as a keyword. For selected text foreground and background, you'll want to use highlight text and highlight respectively. For buttons, you can use button face, and that'll apply to button text. And for window, that'll control background color. And now with the introduction of Forced Color mode, they have a slightly different set of keywords. Again, think about who you're supporting and why and which approach you want to use. So for Forced Colors mode, links use link text. You no longer have to use just an anchor element. Text uses canvas text. Selected text foreground and background use highlight text and highlight. Button text and button background are button text and button face, and canvas is background color. Here's the comparison. So the notable things here are slight shifting in verbiage between high contrast mode and Forced Colors. In addition, there's a couple gaps in coverage for the button, where Forced Colors has both the button background color and the text, and Forced Colors can apply to anything that you use this keyword and is not just consigned to just the anchor element, which is good when dealing with third-party code because you can't always control the markup that other people write, unfortunately. And you might be thinking now, like, isn't this limited? To which I say, yes, that's the point. Here's another tweet I quite like from Kitty, where they say, high contrast mode is not about design anymore, but strict usability. You should aim for highest readability, not color aesthetics. So like, you want to keep things predictable here. You want gentle nudges, not complete overhauls. You shouldn't be creating a bespoke Forced Color mode experience. Instead, you want to audit your content, see what doesn't hold up, and really kind of do the work to get it back to looking the way it should be. And the reason I say this in terms of predictable is because this is an experience that applies to the operating system, the website you work on, but also the rest of the internet. And especially when you consider a low vision context, You really want to make sure that your buttons look like buttons, your links look like links, your text looks like text, just for that, that wonderful, great external consistency goodness. So now we're going to take some common examples of like how to break down and demonstrate how to use this light touch that I'm talking about. So kind of to get into it, we have here a very trendy web text input without a border, a label that says your name, and then a placeholder that says example John. And in normal mode, this looks okay. Like I pretty much understand this is a text input. But when we enable high contrast mode, and I'm going to shift now into that, all right, taking a sec for it to apply. So because we don't have a border, there is no border for force colors mode to render it. And the other thing I'd like to point out here is that the placeholder is now being displayed quite brightly because of this theme. So like, I might not know this is a text input, especially in a low vision context where I'm zoomed in. And the placeholder doesn't look quite so placeholdery anymore. And so there's a chance I might accidentally think that this is already pre-entered text input. Let's just shift back out of force colors mode. So what we can do about this is move the placeholder up, out, and incorporate it as part of the label. So now there's a clear delineation between the input itself and the kinds of examples we want to see. It's a lot more obvious as well. But this border situation is not, is still persistent. So what do we do about that? So we can write a force colors mode or a high contrast mode color keyword. So when this is active, we can now write a rule. Any input now gets a border of 2 pixels solid white. And I'm going to turn on force colors mode again to kind of demonstrate this. And cool, okay, so this is looking good. We have a text input with an example and then a border to understand that it is an input you can type things into. But what happens if they use white or light gray or like a light value for their background color? This static declaration of white in a hex code is not going to hold up. So because of this, we can use the button face value instead, and that will dynamically map to whatever we have set. And the cool part here is, we don't know what color somebody will be using, but button face communicates I'm a thing that's clickable. So we have that external consistency to say like, yes, you can click on the text input because it uses the color of a thing you can click and take action on. Another example here is a button without a border that has been crafted using ARIA. ARIA is used when, for whatever reason, you can't use a semantic HTML element. This is coded up pretty well, provided that the underlying JavaScript works pretty well, and it is a download pizza button. And man, I wish I could download a pizza. So it looks okay in regular viewing mode, but when I shift into force colors mode, because it doesn't have a border, it's just the phrase download pizza floating in space. ARIA, or force colors mode and high contrast mode, also does not understand ARIA, so it's using the static text version. So like as a user, I don't know that I can click this because it doesn't have a lot of affordances to tell me that I can. It might be a prompt to download pizza, so I might scroll down to see like what they're talking about, like maybe it's a page heading. So what we can do about this is turn on high contrast mode support in a media query, and then target anything with a role button and give it a nice chunky border with button text, and also update the color to use button text. And this communicates that, yep, it's a button, does buttony things. I can now download a pizza, cool and great. I'd also like to point out here that I'm using a thicker border because of low vision considerations. A 1 pixel border hairline kind of might not cut it. So this is an example where you want to get a little bit heavy-handed with your approach in terms of those gentle nudges. I also find that rounded edges help because they're a great affordance to help communicate that something is buttony as opposed to linky or info boxy. The other thing to be aware of is gradients are technically background images. And Edge has opinions about this in a force color mode. More on this in a second. So, content considerations, shifting back out of forced colors mode. Here's, now that we kind of know how to manipulate this stuff under the hood with CSS, here's some advice for some common content you'll see on the web and working with it. Background images, like I mentioned before, this is about pure usability and not aesthetics. So, quote here from Terrell Thompson, I quite like: don't use CSS background images to deliver content. Content is important, it deserves first-class treatment. And one of the things to keep in mind here is high contrast mode and force colors mode might actually just discard your background image, which is not great if it contains critical information. The other thing is it will apply what is called a backplate, and that is a background color that maps to the canvas color, and that's to just help ensure legibility at all cost. It's not very visually pleasing to me as an individual, but it is legible. And I don't know about you, but I'd rather have something ugly and usable over something pretty but illegible any day of the week. Raster images. These are images that are described with pixels, JPEGs, PNGs, GIFs, etc. They're static, which means the browser does not know what content they contain. This means, force colors mode and high contrast mode doesn't really know what they are. So the important thing here is to really make sure that you have accurately described alternative text for these images. And again, I mentioned that low vision kind of situation where there might be an individual who is augmenting force colors mode or high contrast mode with a screen reader to kind of help them navigate the web. Not all screen reader users are blind. That's another common misconception that we have, and this speaks to using multiple forms of assistive technology to get what you want. SVG are cool. They describe images using markup, and computers can read markup. So there's some considerations here for high contrast mode. Here, we have a non-interactive icon to accompany kind of some code here. We can say fill that with the text color keyword and that'll hold up. There's currently a bug with SVG that'll be resolved in a little bit, but effectively that'll say update your non-interactive icons to update to match whatever color the user has set for text. For interactive icons, what we can do here is we can make some styling instructions to preserve that buttoniness. Here we have some Microsoft Word style button icons, and shifting into force colors mode and waiting for it to change. We can preserve that buttoniness and really kind of drive home that, yep, there are buttons, you can click on them, do buttony stuff. Shifting back out. For SVG, for charts, first you want to kind of delineate not using color alone, so I've used some texture here. And we can control that with color declarations for background color, stroke, and fill. And then target that in high contrast mode, replacing that with color keywords to help kind of disambiguate what each value means. Shifting this back into force colors mode, we can see that a simple chart will adapt, which is pretty cool. Shifting back out. For complicated SVG images like this one, it's best to leave them alone. You really can't adapt something this complicated to a limited keyword set. For audio and video, the name of the game here is making sure that your content is described, using alternate descriptions, so captions and transcripts. And the cool thing here is, VTT captions will dynamically update in high contrast mode and force colors mode for you, which is another great example of semantic goodness. Some fancy tricks here I'm going to kind of blow through a little bit quickly. You can create utility classes, remove something from high contrast mode but maintain layout. You can do stuff like force content to display as text even in high contrast mode. That's great when working with third-party code or just weird things that designers do that you can't really control. Another thing here, credit to Joe Watkins, is draw an invisible border that it renders when high contrast mode is active. Here we're using the transparent color keyword, and transparent may be transparent when it is in regular view mode, but when we shift over transparent as a keyword, and force colors mode and high contrast mode will say, aha, there's a border here, and apply the color treatment for a border. So you can do a little bit, you don't have to do the extra effort of writing a media query, which I think is pretty cool. You can also do kind of IE detection. Careful here, you really don't want to do device sniffing, but you can write JavaScript queries for if MS high contrast active is matches in a match media JavaScript statement. You can kind of provide support for IE 10 and up, or do other stuff depending. You might want something like this when you're working with like a legacy application. A lot of intranets have this kind of problem. So how do you do this? Like, now that you know technically under the hood how it all works, you test, you look at your stuff in these modes, and then you keep looking at your stuff in this modes, and you get other people to do it, and you normalize doing it, and you socialize it to your QA team. The real problem here is this is like a dark corner of development, so you want to kind of help shed as much light on it as possible. And if you're not doing accessibility testing in your like regular testing, there's no time like the present to get started. So where do you do it? You can do it early in your process, and you can do it late in your process. And here we have the shift left methodology of as you take your idea and turn it into a product, time and cost magnify exponentially. So early and later of the two, I like to do it kind of as close to the ideation phase as possible. So when you start first creating those UI elements in code that you're going to be using to build the entire experience in a design pattern library, pop open force colors mode and check it. Like, does it work? Cool, great. Now you have a good pattern to reference as you move forward. If it doesn't, make some tweaks, good to go. But okay, I work in web development, so I have a Mac by default. I don't have a Windows computer. There are options, and this is cool. You can download VirtualBox, which is a free app put out by Oracle, and then Microsoft actually gives out free virtual machines, which is a computer running inside of a computer, from IE8 all the way up to Microsoft Edge, and they do this so you can test with Windows. That's pretty cool. Microsoft Edge actually just rolled out support for emulating a forced color mode treatment. The note here is it only supports light and dark themes and not the full range of customization. So you want to kind of be careful here that these emulated themes may not be indicative of the theme somebody is actually using. Polypane, which is another app I quite like a lot, also has this emulated support, and I use this app a lot for responsive debugging as well. So while you're there, you might as well just turn it on and off and see if everything's working, in addition to being nice and responsive. And then Assistive Labs, which is, I think, my favorite of these options, which is a paid service. And it is a service where it is dedicated assistive technology testing in a browser window. So it's emulated operating systems with NVDA preloaded, JAWS as well if you pay a little bit extra. And you can quickly pop this up. It takes seconds to boot up. You can also have a development tunnel. So things that you're working on your Mac, you can actually load up on Windows and see how it works there. Big fan of the product, and the person behind it is a really cool dude. And kind of in closing here, I'd like to leave you with this thought that good user experiences meet the user where they are, and not where we hope they'll be. So, wrapping up, just thank you for this opportunity. Thank you to, my lovely hosts for allowing me this opportunity. Thank you to the captioner, and thank you to the sign language interpreter, and thank you to you, most importantly, the audience, for tuning in. Thanks.
got some really good questions in the Q&A, and hopefully we'll be able to get through all of them. Just a reminder for anybody that that didn't see the notification before, please ask any questions into the Q&A, not into the regular chat, and we'll try to get through those. And so let me just go back up to the top. So the first question is from Jeanette, and they ask, what are the best testing tools to use for design and testing?
Oh, for design. This is a really good question. I feel that design tools are really lacking when it comes to accessibility related concerns. The best I've seen are annotation toolkits created by individual users. And to my knowledge, none of them include a check how this works in high contrast mode like flag. So I think in terms of tooling here, the real answer is it's your job as a designer to be a diplomat and socialize that A, this exists, B, we should do something about it, and then C, like carving out time to work with developers to take a look at the components that you're designing. It's a very easy thing to say. It's a kind of a difficult thing to do. So, it depends on your org size and maturity as well as priorities, much like a lot of accessibility work. I know that's not probably the answer you wanted to hear, but this has been reflective of my experience.
Great. Simon asks, does Mac have a high contrast mode as well?
Yeah, sort of. And this is where it gets weird. So Mac has, I'm blanking on the term because of course, but a toggle in the accessibility preferences, which increases the contrast on the borders of stuff, but it's not a true dynamic high contrast mode theme. And the really interesting you kind of you touched on here is there's a lot of weight behind this upcoming standard, cross-browser standard, where Windows right now is the only operating system that can create fully dynamic themes, whereas Linux, I'm not quite sure, it's its own special thing, but Mac OS, iOS, and Android will probably have to do significant work under the hood to update how they draw the operating system UI. Candidly, I think that's a good thing. I think high contrast mode is a really deeply personal thing you can do to improve access for yourself. So I'd love to kind of see those updates happen on these other operating systems.
Next up, we have a question from Kylie. They ask, they say, the quote about our experiences not being universal and the way in which we design things having the potential to exclude someone else from the experience is valuable. You mentioned talking to the people that use our products to figure out the best, how best to support them, and they love this. Thanks for sharing. So if you have anything else you want to add on that, and if not, I can go to the next question.
Yeah, no, I just want to echo that. Like, I used to think I knew things, and then I tested with people, and then I'm like, oh no, I know nothing.
Right. Next is a question from Margie. Do people ever complain about high contrast mode causing visual reverberation?
Probably. So visual reverberation. So like, I'm assuming that's kind of like, fatigue, eye fatigue caused by high contrasty colors.
Right, or maybe that strobing effect you were talking about.
Yeah, that's why I'm kind of like because the problem with high contrast mode is you need to know it exists. So like that's why when you're doing kind of your initial design, you want to avoid those extreme values. And then when high contrast mode is in play, it's a matter of if the user is aware that they can create their own custom themes or not. There's not a lot of control you have there. So hopefully somebody figured out that, there's more than just the stock themes and that they can customize it.
Next, we have a question from Aditya, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. And they say, Eric, first of all, thank you so much for all the information. What is your preferred contrast checker application?
um, yeah, I like Stark. Really nice folks doing some exciting things. I also like the WebAIM just plug in to colors and see what pops out for a contrast ratio. It's something with in government work that we're actually very sensitive to because we are mandated under Section 508, and colors in a design system get really complicated really fast.
Yep, definitely. Simon asks, are fonts an issue too? And what I mean is some fonts can be very thin and difficult to read. Is there a way to force the system to use larger or boldface fonts in addition to forcing high contrast?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you don't want to make assumptions for the end user. They may have existing modifications that you're using, so operating system and browser level text size adjustment. I will say, as a designer, I hate those hairline thin fonts. Like, I feel we shouldn't be allowed to use them because, you know, changing your fonts is only as good as the end user knowing that they can do that, which brings into questions about tech literacy. If you are using a variable font, which is a font where you can use math to control the weight and other aspects, a little nudge you can do is when force colors mode is activated is take that thin font and make it slightly thicker. That's a crafty little trick you can do, but I advise some caution here because you don't want to make sweeping assumptions.
Next is a question from Allison. Do you have any tips to improve readability when the colors of a brand identity are not accessible? In their case, a university, so not so much opportunity to modify them.
Yeah, this is a really big problem. This is where opinions collide with usability. I still struggle with it, honestly. People's notions of aesthetics are complicated. Um, Strategies I have seen are child design systems where you you take those colors and you create spiritual successors that are derived but also contrasty enough. Be careful there because you're off the beaten path, and that can be both politically and maintainable, like tough to navigate. The other thing that I think I've had a lot of success with is inclusive design and accessibility are really cool right now. And marketing departments want to be cool. And you can point to a lot of these very big popular companies, such as Google, that just rolled out like inclusivity initiatives and say, like, hey, here's this thing. If we want to be a progressive company, maybe we should update these branding values. And if there's one thing marketing likes doing, it's updating their branding. So tie it into a new initiative if you can. Again, this speaks to your role as designer, as kind of diplomat, so just be very careful here.
Yeah, that's a good point. Next is a question from Mo. For the JPEGs and other images that are just for show, how do you set it to not read to the screen reader? And does that confuse the user that is not totally blind, like you mentioned, if you do not, in quotes, read it?
Yeah, so if an image is purely decorative, you can null its alt attribute by using alt equals open double quotes, close double quotes with no space in between. And that will signal to a screen reader that this image is decorative and it's not worth announcing. The other thing here is you want to be really cognizant of being the arbiter of what's important and not. By which I mean there's a lot of power to consider here, where you're making choices for another individual whether or not they can see this image. And a lot of image placement on the modern web is very intentional. So chances are good that this image has been put there for a reason, and you want to communicate why that image has been placed. And there are kind of opinions here on if this is too noisy or not for screen reader users, but I fall on the side that screen readers have the ability to silence announcements if they don't want to hear them. So better to provide it and have somebody self-select than to not provide it and potentially make somebody miss out on something critical.
That's a good point. Next up, we have a couple of questions regarding CMS. So Kelsey asks, how do you suggest people address high contrast when they're using a CMS?
Yeah, I love CMSs because I'm a big nerd. CMSs are great because they churn out consistent and repeatable pages. So one thing we did actually recently is we investigated high contrast mode as a ticketable sprint work for our CMS and our design system, where we audited our templates, took a selection of pages and checked them out, see how they worked, made some tweaks, and treated it like any other kind of bug fix work.
Great. And then also dealing with CMSs, Weston asks, I use CMS for the college that I work for. I generally create promotional graphics. I'm looking for any tips to design them to be accessible. What effect does the high contrast mode have on the graphic? And what could I do to make the graphics more accessible for people with low vision?
Yeah, that's a really cool question too. If the graphics are static images, so JPEGs, PNGs, bitmaps, what have you, high contrast mode will ignore it. So it'll present as designed. So I'd say, the two things here are have descriptive alternate text. If it's a complicated graphic, maybe a link offsite where you can digest that in long text format. The other thing is, bake good color contrast into the design itself. So for those individuals with low vision conditions that aren't aware that force color mode exists, it'll just work for them out of the box.
Great. Next, we have a question from Sally. Does high contrast mode or forced color mode bother the eyes, eye strain more than usual? You mentioned eye fatigue. They say stupid question, but there is no such thing. Does blue light affect or change high contrast mode or low contrast mode?
Yeah, no, that's not a stupid question at all. I don't know. I will tell you, when I do auditing with high contrast mode active, if I stare at it for too long, I do get a little bit of eye fatigue, but I also shift themes around a lot because I don't want to make assumptions that high contrast mode theme 2 is the default experience. I would also kind of point to that emergent usage behavior of deliberately creating a low contrast theme. So like very light blue on a white background for everything, potentially. So I think the name of the game here is it might, but that's okay because you don't really have control over it. In terms of the environment that you're viewing something, so like a blue light, amber light context, this gets into physiology, and I am not a scientist here in this field. I've done a little bit of reading about it, and as far as I know, results are inconclusive. That being said, I have a Kindle that uses an amber light for night reading, and I like it quite a lot.